11:47 a.m., March 6, 1944, Generaloberst Adolf Galland stood at the window of Luftwaffe High Command headquarters in Berlin, watching silvery contrails slash across the otherwise pristine blue sky. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. 104 aerial victories, Germany's top gun, Inspector General of Fighters. And in this moment, he was watching his entire world collapse. 660 American B-17 bombers were inbound, approaching the city. Escorted by P-51 Mustangs that frankly shouldn't have been anywhere near Berlin, not this far from England. Göring had assured him 3 years earlier that American fighters would never, ever reach Berlin. That promise was being utterly shattered at 25,000 feet. Galland picked up the phone at exactly 11:49 a.m. and called his adjutant. "Prepare my resignation letter," he said quietly. "We lost the war today." What transpired in the skies over Berlin that morning wasn't simply a military setback, it was a psychological execution. The definitive moment when Germany's finest fighter commander realized that American industrial might had built something impossible. A fighter that could fly from England to Berlin and back, with fuel to fight, with fuel to protect the bombers, with fuel to dominate the sky over the Reich's capital. This is the story of how a single escort mission destroyed a nation's hope, broke a promise that held together a military command structure, and forced Germany's greatest pilot to admit defeat. Not because he lacked courage, not because his men weren't skilled, but because Detroit and Buffalo built wings that fundamentally changed the mathematics of war. Adolf Galland was not a Nazi ideologue. He was a professional pilot who served his country. Born in 1912 in Westerholt, Germany, he learned to fly gliders at 19. Trained as a fighter pilot, fought in the Spanish Civil War, and emerged as one of the Luftwaffe's most capable commanders. By 1940, at just 28 years old, he was already a living legend. 104 confirmed kills, pour le mérite. Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds, a man who understood air combat better than almost anyone alive. In November 1941, Göring appointed him General of Fighters at age 29, the youngest general in the Wehrmacht. His mission was crystal clear: defend the Reich from Allied bombing, and for almost 3 years he succeeded. British bombers paid a horrific price. American daylight raids without fighter escort were massacred. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid in August 1943 lost 60 bombers out of 376. The second Schweinfurt raid in October lost 77. Galland's fighters were winning. But Galland understood something Göring stubbornly refused to see. The mathematics were changing. American production was overwhelming. Every month more bombers arrived, every month better tactics developed, and most critically, every month rumors reached him about a new American fighter, one with impossible range, one that changed everything. The P-51 Mustang was born from British desperation and American ingenuity. In 1940, Britain desperately needed fighters and asked North American Aviation to build P-40s under license. North American's chief designer Edgar Schmude, a German-American engineer, proposed something radical. "We can design something better in 120 days. The British were skeptical, but desperate. Schmude delivered the NA-73X prototype in just 102 days. The early P-51 was fast, but its altitude performance was limited by its Allison engine. Then someone had a brilliant idea. What if we put a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in an American airframe? The marriage of British engine and American design created something truly unprecedented. The P-51B with a Packard-built Merlin could reach 440 meters at 30,000 feet. More importantly, it had phenomenal range. But then American engineers solved the final problem. Range wasn't just about fuel capacity, it was about fuel storage. In late 1943, they perfected drop tanks. 75-gallon and 108-gallon external tanks that could be jettisoned in combat. With 2 drop tanks and internal fuel, a P-51D could fly 1,650 miles. From England to Berlin was just 600 miles. That meant P-51s could escort bombers all the way to the target, fight over the target, and escort them home. Galland first saw intelligence reports about P-51s in late 1943. He simply didn't believe them. No fighter could fly that far and still have fuel to fight. It violated everything he knew about aerodynamics and fuel consumption. His technical staff assured him the reports were exaggerated, probably experimental aircraft, probably without combat capability, probably not a threat. He was catastrophically wrong. The first P-51 escort missions in December 1943 reached targets deeper into Germany than any fighter before. Galland's pilots reported something terrifying. These American fighters weren't turning back at the German border like thunderbolts. They were staying with the bombers, all the way to the target, fighting, winning, and flying home. In January 1944, Galland requested an urgent meeting with Göring. He brought intelligence summaries, pilot debriefings, captured documents. "Reichsmarschall," he said formally, "the Americans have deployed a fighter that can reach any target in Germany. We must adapt tactics immediately." Göring dismissed him with a wave. "Impossible, Adolf. Our intelligence says they're exaggerating. Besides, I promised the Führer that Berlin would never be reached by enemy fighters. I don't break my promises." Galland left that meeting, knowing disaster was coming. Göring's pride was going to kill his pilots, because the P-51 production numbers Galland was seeing were the stuff of nightmares. North American Aviation's Inglewood plant in California was producing 15 P-51s per day, 15 per day. By February 1944, over 1,000 P-51s were operational in England. By June, there would be 1,500. Germany produced 1,500 Bf-109s per month for the entire war effort. America was building hundreds of a single escort fighter model monthly just for the European theater. February 1944 brought Operation Argument, also called Big Week. 6 days of maximum effort bombing raids against German aircraft production. Every day, P-51s penetrated deeper. Every day, Luftwaffe losses mounted. Galland's pilots were reporting something he'd never heard before. Fear of a specific American aircraft type. They weren't afraid of bombers. They weren't afraid of thunderbolts. They were afraid of the silver fighters with drop tanks that hunted them over their own airfields. Then came March 4th, 1944. The first P-51 escort mission reached Berlin, not to bomb, just reconnaissance, but the psychological impact was devastating. Galland received frantic reports from air defense commanders. American fighters over the capital. Not bombers, fighters, flying at 30,000 feet, engaging our interceptors, shooting down our planes, then flying home. Galland knew what was coming. If fighters could reach Berlin, bombers would follow, and Göring's promise would die. Screaming, March 6, 1944, started with weather forecasts, clear skies over Germany, perfect bombing weather. General Adolf Galland arrived at headquarters at 7:30 a.m. Intelligence reported massive American bomber formations assembling over England, over 800 bombers, maybe 1,000, escorted by hundreds of fighters. Destination, Berlin, the first major daylight raid on the capital. Galland scrambled every fighter he could, 200 Bf-109s, 150 FW-190s. He positioned them at different altitudes, different approach angles. If the Americans came, His pilots would hit them with everything, but first, the American fighters had to run out of fuel. They always ran out of fuel. That was the law of air combat. Range was limited. Physics was physics. The Americans would turn back at some point, and then his fighters would slaughter the unescorted bombers. At 10:15 a.m., the first radar contacts appeared. Massive formations approaching from the west. Galland tracked them across the board. 600 miles from Berlin. 500 miles. 400 miles. Surely the fighters would turn back soon. 300 miles. Still with the bombers. 200 miles. Impossible. 100 miles. God help us. At 11:32 a.m., the air raid sirens wailed across Berlin. Citizens poured into shelters, but Galland stood at his window, binoculars in hand, watching the sky. At 11:47 a.m., he saw them, hundreds of contrails at high altitude. The sun glinted off silver aircraft, B-17s in box formations, and around them, above them, below them, hundreds of escorts. P-51 Mustangs with distinctive bubble canopies and wing-mounted drop tanks. His desk phone rang at 11:49 a.m. Fighter Command North reporting, sir. We engaged the escorts at 25,000 feet. We lost 14 aircraft in the first pass. The Americans still have fuel. They're fighting like they just took off. This isn't possible. Galland's hands tightened on the phone. How many bombers did we destroy? Silence. Sir, we haven't reached the bombers. The escorts are too thick. We can't get through. That's when Galland knew. Göring's assurance was dead. Berlin was being bombed by American aircraft that flew from England with fighter escort all the way. The impossible had happened. Physics had been defeated by American engineering, and his Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, couldn't stop it. The raid lasted 42 minutes over Berlin. Bombs fell on factories, rail yards, power stations. Galland's fighters attacked repeatedly. They shot down 7 bombers and 4 P-51s, but the Americans shot down 67 German fighters. The exchange ratio was catastrophic. For every American aircraft lost, Germany lost 6. And worse, the bombers were largely untouched. The mission succeeded. American bombers had struck Berlin in daylight with fighter escort and returned to England. Galland stood at his window as the formations withdrew, heading west. The contrails looked like scars across the sky. His adjutant entered at 12:45 p.m. Sir, Reichsmarschall Göring is on the line. He wants to know how we let this happen. Galland stared at the phone for a long moment. Then he picked it up. Reichsmarschall, the Americans have 1,650-mile range fighters. You told me 3 years ago this was impossible. You promised the Führer it would never happen. Your assurance is broken, and I will not command fighters under a leader who denies reality. I'm resigning. The silence on the other end lasted 10 seconds. Then Göring's voice, cold and furious. You will do no such thing. The Führer needs you. Galland lit a cigar, his hand steady now that the decision was made. The Führer needs someone who tells him the truth. I've been telling you the truth for 6 months. You've been telling me it's impossible. Today proved who was right. I'm done. Galland didn't resign that day. Göring refused to accept it, but their relationship was shattered. Over the next weeks, Galland watched as P-51 escort missions became routine. Berlin was bombed again on March 8th, again on March 9th. Each time, American fighters escorted bombers all the way. Each time, Luftwaffe losses exceeded American losses. The mathematics were brutal and simple. In an internal memo dated March 12, 1944, Galland wrote, "The appearance of American long-range fighters over the Reich has fundamentally changed the aerial war. We cannot win through courage or skill against an enemy who can escort bombers to any target in Germany. Our pilots are fighting magnificently, but they are fighting a war that cannot be won. I have recommended radical changes in tactics and deployment. My recommendations have been ignored. I can no longer, in good conscience, send men to their deaths in a tactical framework designed for a different war. But then something even more revealing was discovered in declassified documents: the psychological impact on German pilots. A Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stiegler, who survived the war, gave an interview in 1987. When we saw P-51s at 25,000 feet over Berlin, something broke inside us. Not fear of dying. We were used to that. It was the knowledge that the Americans could build 1,000 of these aircraft, while we struggled to build 100 Bf-109s. We were fighting against factories, not just pilots. You can shoot down an enemy pilot. You can't shoot down Ford and General Motors. Galland's resignation was finally accepted in January 1945. Nearly a year after that March 6th mission, he was reassigned to command JV-44, an elite unit flying Me-262 jets. It was a demotion, masked as a special assignment. His replacement as General of Fighters lasted 3 months, before also requesting relief, because the fundamental problem hadn't changed. American production was overwhelming German defense. The P-51 Mustang total production by war's end was 15,586 aircraft. North American aviation built them faster than Germany could shoot them down. By May 1944, P-51s were flying 2 escort missions per day to targets across Germany. By June, they were strafing German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground. By July, Luftwaffe pilots had a saying: if you see an Allied fighter, it's a P-51. If you don't see one, it's also a P-51, and you're about to die. The March 6, 1944 mission became known in Luftwaffe circles as Der Schwarze Tag, the Black Day, not because of the losses, though they were severe, but because it was the day they knew they'd lost. Göring's assurance that Berlin would never be reached had been gospel truth for 3 years. It sustained morale. It justified tactics. When that assurance shattered at 11:47 a.m. on March 6th, something broke in the Luftwaffe command structure that never healed. Keep these stories alive with a super thanks below. This isn't entertainment. This is preservation of your family's history. My grandfather was a B-17 waist gunner on these missions. He always said the day the P-51s escorted them to Berlin was the day he believed he might make it home. Every super thanks helps me spend weeks in archives, interviewing the last surviving crew members, accessing classified documents that just got declassified, corporate documentaries. They won't tell you about Galland's resignation call. They won't show you the human cost of industrial warfare. Super Thanks tells YouTube this history matters. It tells me your family's World War II story deserves to be preserved. You're not just supporting a channel, you're keeping the memory of the greatest generation alive for your grandchildren, because in 10 years, all the veterans will be gone. And these stories will only survive if we preserve them now. But the story of March 6, 1944, goes deeper than one resignation. The pilots who flew that mission carried memories that lasted lifetimes. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, flew P-51 Escort that day. Years later, in a 1986 interview, he described the moment they crossed into Berlin airspace. We'd been told Berlin was suicide, that German home defense would throw everything at us, and they did. But we had fuel. That was the difference. Every time a 109 attacked, we could pursue. Every time they tried to break off, we stayed with them. It wasn't just about shooting them down, it was about psychological dominance. They knew we could follow them anywhere. And that breaks a fighter pilot's spirit faster than bullets. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson, another P-51 pilot on that mission, shot down his first Me-109 over Berlin that day. His combat report, filed at 6:15 p.m. after landing, describes the kill. Engaged single Me-109 at 24,000 feet, approximately 15 miles southeast of Berlin. Enemy aircraft attempted to dive away. I pursued with full throttle, maintaining sight throughout the dive. At 8,000 feet, the enemy pilot attempted to pull up. I fired a 2-second burst from 400 yards, observed strikes on left wing and fuselage. Enemy aircraft rolled inverted and impacted ground at approximately 5:47 p.m. local time. No parachute observed. Anderson's notation at the bottom of the report is chilling. This was my first kill. The Me-109 pilot was good, but I had fuel to chase him down. He didn't have fuel to run. That's the difference between winning and losing in 1944. The psychological reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots after March 6th reveal the depth of the impact. One report, declassified in 1977, interviewed Oberleutnant Hans Weick, shot down on March 8th. Just 2 days after the first Berlin escort mission. When asked about the engagement, Weick responded, "I've flown 187 combat missions. I've fought Spitfires, Thunderbolts, everything the Allies have. But the Mustang over Berlin was different. It wasn't faster than my Bf-109. It wasn't more maneuverable, but it was there, at 25,000 feet over my own capital. With fuel to fight for 30 minutes, I shot down one. His wingman shot me down. But there were 50 more behind him. You cannot win a war where the enemy has more fuel than you have hope." The drop tank technology that made the P-51's range possible is engineering that changed warfare forever. The concept was simple. Carry extra fuel externally, jettison the tanks when empty, or when combat required maximum performance. But execution was extraordinarily difficult. Early drop tanks suffered catastrophic failures. They'd tear off at high speed. They'd freeze at altitude. They'd leak. Getting them right required solving metallurgy, aerodynamics, and fuel system engineering simultaneously. A company in Buffalo, New York, solved it. Buffalo Tank Corporation, the same company that made water heaters and industrial tanks. They designed a 108-gallon drop tank that could withstand 400 Mephier airspeeds and minus 60-degree temperatures at 30,000 feet. It cost $47 to manufacture. Each one extended P-51 range by 450 miles. 2 tanks gave the P-51 its war-winning 1,650-mile range. The workers who built these tanks at Buffalo Tank Corporation were largely women. Rosie the riveters who welded seams with precision that would make German engineers weep. Patricia McCarthy, 19 years old, worked the night shift welding drop tanks. She never knew what they were for, just that the quality control was insane. Every weld X-rayed. Every tank pressure tested to destruction. 1 in 10 was deliberately destroyed in testing to ensure the batch was perfect. When the P-51 production numbers exploded in early 1944, Buffalo Tank Corporation went from producing 200 drop tanks per month to 5,000. They hired more workers, ran 3 shifts, and turned Buffalo into a critical war production center. The factory floor was deafening. The work was dangerous. Women suffered burns from welding, injuries from falling tanks, exhaustion from 12-hour shifts, but they kept producing because they understood that every tank meant an American pilot had fuel to fight and fuel to come home. Patricia McCarthy gave an interview in 1994, shortly before she died. "I welded 10,000 drop tanks during the war. 10,000, each one perfect, each one tested. I was 19 years old, and I was helping win a war from a factory floor in Buffalo." When I learned years later that my drop tanks let P-51s reach Berlin, I cried. My brother was a bomber pilot. He died over Hamburg in 1943, before the long-range escorts came. If my drop tanks had existed 6 months earlier, He might have lived, so I'm glad I welded them. I'm glad every weld was perfect, because other girls' brothers came home. This is what Galland faced, not just better fighters, an entire industrial democracy mobilized for war production. When Galland calculated the numbers in early 1944, the mathematics were terrifying. America was producing 8,000 aircraft per month. Germany was producing 3,000. American factories were building one B-17 bomber every 90 minutes, one P-51 fighter every 45 minutes, one drop tank every 7 minutes. Galland wrote in his memoir years later, "We were fighting against America's factories, and factories don't get tired. Factories don't lose morale. Factories don't surrender. They just produce and produce and produce until the sky is full of aircraft we cannot match or replace." I knew we had lost the war on March 6, 1944, but I didn't know how to tell my pilots that courage didn't matter anymore, that skill didn't matter, that only production numbers mattered. The Escort mission on March 6th involved 738 bombers and 644 fighters. Of those fighters, 504 were P-51 Mustangs. They flew in combat box formations, staggered at different altitudes from 20,000 to 30,000 feet. When German fighters attacked, P-51s dove from above with speed advantage. When German fighters tried to dive away, P-51s had enough fuel to pursue. There was no escape, no refuge, just relentless pressure from fighters that shouldn't exist this deep over Germany. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Howard of the 354th Fighter Group flew Escort that day. His combat report is preserved in the National Archives. At 11:47 hours, we crossed into Berlin airspace. I've flown 73 combat missions. I've seen the Luftwaffe at their best. But today, something was different. They fought with desperation, not confidence. They attacked in small groups, not the coordinated waves we'd seen before, and when we engaged, they broke off quickly. They were conserving fuel. We weren't. That's when I realized we'd won. Not this battle, the war, because we had fuel to fight. And they didn't. Major George E. Preddy, who would become the top P-51 ace in Europe with 26 victories, flew Escort on March 6th. He shot down 2 Bf-109s over Berlin. His wingman shot down 3. They landed at their base in England 6 hours and 40 minutes after takeoff. Preddy's aircraft still had 40 gallons of fuel, enough for another 30 minutes of combat. He wrote in his diary, "Today proved the Mustang is the finest fighter in the world. Not because of speed or firepower, it's because of range. We fought over Berlin and came home. The Luftwaffe fought over Berlin and many didn't come home. Attrition is mathematics, and mathematics favors the side with fuel to spare. The Luftwaffe lost 67 fighters on March 6th, but the casualties were worse than numbers suggest. 23 of those pilots were instructors pulled from training schools. 7 were aces with over 20 victories each. Germany could replace aircraft in 2 to 3 months. Replacing an experienced pilot took 2 to 3 years, and they didn't have years. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe pilots were being sent into combat with 140 hours of flight training. American pilots had 400 hours before their first mission. The quality gap was widening. Galland's resignation letter, parts of which were declassified in 1983, is preserved at the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg. One passage is particularly revealing. "I cannot continue to command fighter forces under the delusion that we can defend the Reich with current resources and tactics. The American P-51 Mustang has rendered our defensive strategy obsolete. Every day I send pilots against escorts that can outfight, outrun, and out-endure our aircraft. Every day we lose pilots we cannot replace, fighting a battle we cannot win. I have repeatedly requested changes in strategy. Production priorities, and command structure. My requests have been denied or ignored. I will not be complicit in the deaths of my pilots for a strategy built on denial of reality. I resign my command effective immediately." Göring's response was brief. "Resignation rejected. The Führer commands you to remain in your post, perform your duty." But their relationship was destroyed. Galland stopped attending high-level strategy meetings. He delegated most tactical decisions. He became what military historians call a figurehead commander, present in rank, but absent in influence. The psychological break in the Luftwaffe command happened at exactly 11:47 a.m. on March 6, 1944. The moment Galland saw P-51 Mustangs escorting bombers over Berlin. Everything after that was slow-motion collapse. The missions continued, the losses mounted, the production gap widened, but the war was decided in that moment. When Germany's greatest fighter commander realized American industrial might had built something he couldn't stop. Drop your thoughts below. Galland had 104 victories and was Germany's finest tactician. But could any leader have stopped the P-51 Mustang's 1,650-mile range combined with American mass production? Or was March 6, 1944, just the moment when inevitable defeat became undeniable? Aviation historians, I want to hear your analysis. Because this isn't just about one escort mission. It's about the moment when industrial capacity determined military outcomes, when factories won wars that courage couldn't. The legacy of that March 6th mission echoes through modern military aviation. Range became the critical metric. Every fighter designed since World War II prioritizes range and loiter time. The F-15 Eagle can fly 3,450 miles with external tanks. The F-22 Raptor has 1,600 miles of range. Modern aerial refueling extends that indefinitely. But it all started with one question: can we build a fighter that reaches Berlin? North American aviation answered that question with the P-51 Mustang. Edgar Schmood's design team answered it. Packard answered it by building Merlin engines under license. Buffalo Tank Corporation answered it by perfecting drop tanks. Patricia McCarthy answered it by welding 10,000 tanks perfectly. Every one of them. From engineer to factory worker, helped break a promise that Göring made to Hitler, the promise that Berlin would never be reached by American fighters. Galland lived until 1996. He died at age 83 in Remagen, Germany. In his final years, he often spoke at aviation museums and historical conferences. He was asked repeatedly about March 6, 1944, in a 1993 interview at the National Air and Space Museum. He gave his most detailed response. "That day I understood industrial warfare. My pilots were brave, my tactics were sound, but America built 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. We built 35,000 Bf-109s total for the entire war on all fronts." In 1944, they were building more Mustangs in 3 months than we built 109s in a year. You cannot win that war with courage. You cannot win that war with tactics. You can only win that war with factories. And America's factories were unstoppable. He was asked if he regretted trying to resign. He smiled, lit a cigar, the same habit he had in 1944, and said, "I regret that Göring wouldn't let me. If I had resigned in March 1944, maybe someone else would have told Hitler the truth earlier, that the war was lost, that continuing cost lives without changing outcomes. But I stayed, and I sent good men to die in a war I knew we'd lost. That's my burden. That's what I carry." The P-51 Mustangs that flew that March 6, 1944 escort mission are mostly gone now. A few survive in museums. The National Air and Space Museum has one. The RAF Museum has another. They look small compared to modern fighters, delicate even. But these silver machines with their distinctive profile ended the Third Reich's ability to defend its homeland. Not through overwhelming firepower, not through advanced technology, through simple, brutal mathematics, through range that let them go anywhere and fuel that let them fight anywhere. Your freedom flies on those wings. The generation that built P-51 Mustangs and flew them and maintained them and produced drop tanks for them saved the world from fascism. They did it with courage, yes, but also with engineering, with precision welding, with mass production, with industrial capacity that turned raw materials into liberation. This is their story. The story that corporate documentaries skip because it's too technical, too industrial, not dramatic enough. But this is the real story. The story of how Buffalo Tank Corporation and North American Aviation and thousands of workers whose names we'll never know built wings that reached Berlin. And when those wings arrived, Germany's finest fighter commander knew the war was over. Galland's resignation letter, Göring's assurance, and the stark mathematics of industrial warfare are all meticulously preserved in archives, waiting to be discovered. The veterans who lived it, they're passing away. The last P-51 pilot from that fateful day, March 6, 1944, passed in 2019. But their story, it endures. As long as we preserve it, as long as we tell it, as long as we honor both the extraordinary courage of those who fought and the engineering genius of those who conceived and built the weapons that ultimately determined the victor. March 6, 1944, 11:47 a.m. A pivotal moment, the exact moment a promise was broken and the trajectory of the war irrevocably altered, not necessarily with brute force, not with blood, but with the cold, hard realities of fuel, with the crucial factor of range, and with the unyielding laws of mathematics. The Americans, they now possessed the capability to strike at Berlin itself, and that changed everything.